Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 113 of Humanity Rising. Virtually every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world have come together in the midst of this extraordinary pandemic to offer essentially a sacred space, a global commons each day, so that people globally can come together and share their experiences of what it's like navigating through this unbelievable, unprecedented human experience that's put most of us under some form of lockdown, social distancing, acute awareness of our health, anxiety about the human future. And so Humanity Rising is simply an offering of a sacred space where we not only share our experiences, but we share the solutions that we're implementing, that we're seeking to scale globally. And we confer as to how we can come together more effectively, those of us in the progressive movement. And by the progressive movement, I mean everyone everywhere who's working tirelessly to create a better world. How can we come together in such an enhanced way, strategically, that we can actually make a difference in the post-pandemic world? So we've been dealing with fundamental issues. We've had all manner of disciplines, from economics and politics and culture and entertainment and the arts to science, history, anthropology, philosophy, spirituality, because this pandemic has affected all of us everywhere. And everything that we thought constituted human civilization has been brought essentially to a halt, put the whole world in the same conversation, and offered us a unique opportunity to recreate the world anew. And so it's with a pleasure that I introduce this program. But before we launch in, I want to initiate 1 minute of heart coherence. The world is crazy out there. It's deconstructing right before our eyes. It's filled our lives with a centrifugal, chaotic energy that's deconstructing reality as we know it. The most important thing any of us can do right now, wherever you are, whoever you are, is to practice heart coherence. So every day on Humanity Rising, we take just 1 minute. We place our attention on our hearts. Try to listen to your heartbeat. Close your eyes, and in a spirit of gratitude, listen to your heartbeat and feel the heartbeat of all the good people everywhere. Thank you, everyone. Many of you who were present at the initial opening session of Humanity Rising on the 22nd of May will remember me saying that I went through a thought experiment in the month of April as the pandemic was really descending in earnest. And all of us began to realize that this was not just a passing phenomenon, but that the world was being stopped in its tracks. And we were being compelled by nature to think big thoughts about the human future at a moment when scientists are telling us that if we don't do some radical transformational activity, we could lose the world as we know it. We all know this. So I went through a thought experiment and I said to myself, if I was dictator for a day of the whole world and I could make one decision, what would it be? And my first thought was that I would stop any further oil drilling. And I thought, well, that solves a crisis, but it actually doesn't change anything. It's not as transformational as the pandemic. Then I thought about stopping the deforestation of the Amazon. And again, I thought that stops a crisis, but it doesn't change the system in the way that we desperately need change. And I thought for quite a while, and all of a sudden it dawned on me that if I was dictator for a day and I had one decision, I would order that within the next 30 days, executive leadership in every government and organization in the world be turned over to women between now and 2030. And when I thought that thought, my heart just burst with a knowing that if we could do something that profound, that simple, and that obvious, we could change the world. And that in fact, if we don't, we may forfeit the world. And what I said on the 22nd of May, I would say again today, the empowerment of women in a radical, imminent way is far more than just a cultural nicety and good idea due to some notion of political correctness. It's actually a national security issue. It may hold the key to human survival. So when I met Karen Downs a few weeks ago and had a conversation with her, I invited her and, as it turns out, her daughter to have a mother-daughter conversation with me and with all of you. And I invite all of you on the Zoom call to write down your comments and chats as we go along, because we're going to be dealing today with a very powerful issue. What is the feminine? We've had the rise of women over the last 50 to 60 years in an unprecedented way. It's the first time in the history of the world, certainly the history of civilization, where women en masse, virtually everywhere, have sought social, political, and economic liberation. And in some countries and in some regions, the progress has been more advanced than others. But women everywhere are engaging in a transformation of human relations as they track the vector of their own empowerment. So we're very privileged today to have two women who've been working on this issue for a long time. Karen was one of the pioneers of the health food industry in the 1980s and built a global company. She's been consulting with women in India and Pakistan and in the corporate boardrooms for decades. She is the founder of Flourish Institute and the co-founder with Rebecca and others of FemmeQ. She's involved in Catalyst 2030. Rebecca has lived much of that with her, and in her own right consults with organizations and companies on organizational development and the empowerment of women, with a master's in international development and a BA in business, now living in Costa Rica. So we're very pleased to have two women with us today that will explore the issue of feminine IQ. So I think we'll start, Karen, with you, and then with Rebecca, just to say a little bit more about your life and how the issue of women's empowerment began to live within you in a way that has brought you into the forefront of the feminist movement. And then we want to concentrate the discussion today on the issue of, if you really think deeply, what actually constitutes feminine intelligence as opposed to masculine intelligence. It's a very complex issue, but one which is seminal to understand in our time. So welcome, Karen. Welcome, Rebecca. And Karen, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm just going to pause for a moment, just arrive in the conversation. And I think it's so important to underscore what you said, Jim. This is a complex and sometimes confusing, debatable, political as a conversation to have. So where I'd love to begin and why we chose Jim and why Rebecca and I are here today is because the heart coherence, we had a moment to cohere our hearts. And that's where I want to begin, because it is particular that Rebecca and I, as mother and daughter, are here today because it's one of my beliefs, well, not beliefs, it's a fact of science, is that for most human beings, our mothers are the only ones we ever share a heartbeat with. So everyone that's on the call today, everyone that's listening today has shared a heartbeat with their mother. And as a mother and daughter, that's where my journey began into, for sure, my feminine intelligence was the instinct, the intuition I had to develop very quickly to, once I knew I was pregnant, to understand what it was that was going on inside me and the life that I was bringing into the world, and what would I do to protect, nurture and nourish that life that was within, the mystery and the miracle that was within, and then how would I bring my baby into the world and have her nourished. And back then in the 80s, I didn't know it was a her. I just knew that that's what I needed to do and find out about that. So I want to start where we began, Jim, in our conversation, which was the thing that you said was a fascination to you is, so I've just spoken about why Rebecca and why it's important to have the mother-daughter conversation, I think, today. And so I'm going to do a little bit of the talking and then we'll start exchanging and Rebecca's voice will come in. So FemmeQ is how you found out about me, or what was mentioned in our call, Jim, and then we started the conversation. So FemmeQ, as you mentioned, is an organisation that was started in 2016 by 4 women. 3 of my colleagues and I got together, we were having a conversation that if the gender conversation is so confusing and complex, what's the conversation that's needed to emerge into a new consciousness, to a new way of being, that the feminine intelligence can take its place in the human psyche? Because the patriarchal system, as we understand it, and as we are living inside of that system, has not respected and honoured the feminine. It's traditionally been seen as, women have been seen as fluffy and soft, and they have not been the required responses to what was happening in the world, or how to build our world, or how to build the future. So FemmeQ became an organisation that we started, and we did 4 international summits. We did 1 in Berlin, 2 in London, and 1 in LA, and we had amazing participation from people all over the world. But what was interesting is we were trying not to talk about gender, because feminine intelligence is what women and men have, but it has not been cultivated and respected in the human psyche to be developed fully, so that we can embrace the feminine and we see its value. And what was interesting is who continued to show up in the international summits was women. I think we had maybe 10% men, even though it was an invitation for us to explore this topic. So today's an exploration. Rebecca and I don't have answers, so to speak, but we have been experimenting and exploring this. And I certainly have for 5 decades now, or 4 decades. And Rebecca, for her reasons, which she'll share, has become part of this conversation. So really, it's a delight to be here, and to have this conversation of exploring something that's a very difficult topic, because I've certainly been told I'm taking us backwards, it's binary, it's political, does this make women superior? But I think we need to talk about some of these complexities that exist in the conversation. So I want to pause there and just get Rebecca's voice into the space and say, hey, it's great to see you over there in Costa Rica.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, so as you shared, Mum, there's been a lot in this conversation, the journey that you and I have been on for many years. And just to give a little bit of context about why I came into this and why I joined FemmeQ and moved to Berlin in 2016, was that my background, as you referenced, Jim, has been diverse, as you know, a lot of us have. But I spent many years working in corporate. So working in corporate consulting in leadership and organizational performance. And I started doing that in my 20s. And generally, I was the only female in the room and the only person under 50. And I really started to notice the impact that these environments were having on me. I felt like I had to put on an armor every day to go to work almost. I had to sort of pull up my courage and really show up in those conversations, in those meetings. And I realized that it wasn't just me. And this is a thing that I think is one of the complexities that we're dealing with today, is that it's not just about gender, but it is an aspect of it. So there's so many parts of this. But what I'm talking about wasn't just for me as a woman. I did see this happening to the men in the room as well, where all of us wasn't able to show up in the conversation. The sides of ourselves that I would traditionally consider the feminine principles and the feminine aspects weren't seen as strengths, which is what you referenced, Mum, as well. So I stepped away because I didn't like who I was having to become in order to win in those environments. And for me, that's why this has become such a fundamental conversation for how we move forward as a collective humanity, is that there's been an imbalance, I think, that I've seen in terms of the masculine and the feminine being honored. And until we start to bring that back into balance, each individual doesn't have the opportunity to show up as all that they are. So for me, what's so critical in this conversation is starting to shift to honoring the vulnerability, honoring the compassion, honoring the empathy and the deep listening that we all bring, that are in men and women. And that's why I'm passionate about having this conversation, because I see that that's what's missing. And Jim, I think that would be absolutely starting to happen if we did have the women at the conversation. So that's when it does become gendered. But I think the feminine principles is what I see as missing. And I'm so passionate about how we have this conversation with as many people as we can to to start to bring it back to the mainstream.
Thanks, Rebecca. So, Jim, shall we just press on and chat?
Yes, well, I was just going to say, let's dive in and get to the meat of the discussion. And that is, if you had to define feminine intelligence, what would you say it was or it is?
Thank you. So unlike IQ or the Dan Goleman's work on emotional intelligence, this is something that we can't measure. So this is taking feminine intelligence and the notion that we have access to it, we can feel it, we could attempt to describe it with our language and our English words that we have access to. But I want to offer everyone that it is an inquiry and it takes a felt experience into this. We feel it when it's there and we feel it when it's not there. Now, that sounds very esoteric for many people, but because this notion of feminine has been said, I've heard many men say, I'm very feminine, and then I offer to them, there is something about feminine intelligence that is available to men and women. It is a seed of potential that has to be developed and focused upon to grow. It is not just naturally there. But what I would say that differentiates, and now I'm going to talk about gender because this is when it becomes complex. In a woman's biology, she has the potential. For example, in the umbilical cord, I'm going to be very scientific for a moment. In the umbilical cord, we are feeding, when we're pregnant, when a woman is pregnant, we are feeding and nourishing the child within. And if for those who are listening today believe that, as many do, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience, it was actually Rudolf Steiner that said, as the child takes form, the mother is giving the nourishment and the heartbeat and the blood to foster that miracle of life and bring that miracle alive. And it's in the first 40 days of pregnancy, and 40 days is often said in mythology and religions, 40 days is often referred to as the time that it takes for a shift in consciousness. And it's 40 days that the embryo takes form in the mother. In that time, we don't often talk about, or when with that reference, we don't often recognize that biologically a woman has an intelligence in her body that produces that. So I spoke to Rupert Sheldrake, scientist, one day, and I said, if every organ of the body has intelligence, which is what he speaks about, does a woman have womb intelligence? He said, wow, I think you're onto something. That hasn't been investigated. So I'm very specifically talking about gender right now, because if we're in a village in India or in Bangladesh where I've worked, we could not talk about feminine intelligence per se, but we could talk about the miracle of life that exists in women's bodies. And we could talk about the impact of societal norms that impact those women and gender in India and Bangladesh. So I work with the spectrum, Jim, in response to your question about feminine intelligence. We can access it, but it has to be with a conscious intention that we develop it. So women innately have a connection to the earth through rhythm. Our bodies have cycles that we move through with the moon. So we have an innate intelligence in a woman's body that doesn't exist in a man's body. And that intelligence is also in our Mother Earth. It's why we call her Mother Earth and why we're so connected. So gender is one thing of that wisdom that exists biologically in our system. Then if we come over to the other spectrum and talk about consciousness, then men who have the divine masculine and can cultivate that can also access the feminine intelligence. So we can't quantify it, but we can qualify it into, we can qualify it in terms of the softer aspects of mercy, of care, of devotion, of nourishing and nurturing, of intuition and instinct, which is what we have to develop very quickly in our bodies as a mother. And even if you're not a mother, you have access to that because of your biological system. And I would say that because of the patriarchal system, those qualities of the softer qualities that we've seen exhibited in women's leadership around the world during COVID, for example, Jacinda Ardern, those qualities of compassion, of care, of looking after people's livelihoods, those qualities will have our planet flourish and our lives flourish when we bring those back into equal respect and honouring as we have the masculine, which has been overplayed. So we have gender on one hand, a biological function in our bodies that gives women access to something. And then over the other side of the spectrum, we have the feminine intelligence that exists in both men and women that can be cultivated. So depending on where you are, you can have the gender conversation, which is critical in the developing countries, the global south, and the consciousness conversation. We can have at all levels of society and sectors. So that starts us off.
So you would say then, Karen, that ultimately the feminine intelligence is equally accessible to both men and women, and there would be no aspect of feminine intelligence that would be unique to the woman, to the female.
I think there is something very unique. We all have access to it, yes. It needs to be much more, we need more focus and development on that. Like we have in personal development, we focus on meditation and mindfulness is so, everywhere now. I can remember back in the 80s, it was very rare that we would meditate in the office, and now it's everywhere. It's an essential tool, an essential practice. I think like meditation and mindfulness have become essential practices, I think the focus on developing feminine intelligence is a critical practice to develop that in men and women. And I do believe, and this is going to cause a big debate as I say this, I do believe men's access to that is via women because of our biological function. It is an access to it, understanding, sitting and listening. And I said to someone the other day, why is it that people reach out often and put their hand on a woman's belly? What is that? And the man that I was speaking to said, yeah, that's so intrusive. That's so weird. And I said, but think again, why is that? And I think it's ultimately people are seeking to get in touch with the miracle. It's like, oh my word, how does that happen that you produce that in your body? So I think it is innate in our biology and then can be fostered. But I think many women have shut it down because it's, as Rebecca said, it's not permitted and acceptable to exhibit those qualities at the boardroom table or in the villages in India and Bangladesh where I've sat, where women are not even, they don't know their birth dates, they're sold off as child brides, they're put into rape camps, and then the body and biology is absolutely violated. And so I think this is why the subject is so complex, because men are now and for centuries have used women's bodies in war. When they want to take over a village, they take over the women, because they know if they impregnate a woman, they've now got a cultural dominance in that environment. So this is why this subject is so complex. But I do think, it's a very long answer, Jim, but I do think women innately are in touch with it much more deeply initially than men. And that's a big, bold statement.
Rebecca, what's your comment on these matters?
We come at it from different perspectives as well, because I'm not a mother. So that's a very unique difference between mum and I as well, is that I'm a woman but not a mother. So I've recently done a lot of work in different conversations and different workshops and different things. And again, as controversial as it is, I do think that there is an innate, it's sometimes called womb intelligence, as mum referenced as well. But I think we do have access to both. I remember an example where actually a guy who was working on Wall Street at the time talked about going to work and going to work with one arm tied behind your back was how he felt about not being able to express all that he is. And what I mean by that is the feminine principles that he didn't feel could be recognized. So I know a lot of men who have a lot of these principles, but I do think there is certainly a deep intrinsic expression of them in the ability to create life and hold life that is unique to women. Absolutely. I think we all have access to it, as mum said, but I do think that how we tap into it and how we express it can be very different for men and women. Partly because of the patriarchal system that we've all grown up in for hundreds of years. I think, you know, there's the conversation about what's innate in us, but there's also the environmental impact of the societies that we live in. So, you know, is it easier for some men to express feminine qualities in certain societies, whereas other women in different societies? I think that's absolutely a factor as well. So it's, as we've said, such a complex topic. And I think the upbringings that we've had, the schoolings that we've had, the cultures that we live in, I think that all plays a part of it. But there is definitely something unique to the expression of for women because of, partly because of our biology, as Karen said.
And Rebecca, if you had to offer a definition of feminine intelligence, what would you say constitutes that?
My definition, gosh. I would say it is the deep, intuitive understanding and knowing of a higher intelligence for the collective good. So for me, that's one of the distinctions between the masculine and the feminine intelligence is that I see it as the intellectual intelligence for more of the problem solving, more of the I guess problem solving, intellectual intelligence versus the heart and the intuition. So for me, the feminine intelligence is the deep knowing of what we can access to serve the greater good in a collective sense rather than an individual sense. If that answered your question.
That's a beautiful notion, actually. That's actually quite profound. I'd like to pause there, everyone, because I think Rebecca's just given us a very profound notion of the feminine as the deep, intuitive understanding of the higher good. Now, that's a quite extraordinary notion because it's not a series of qualities. It's a kind of a, I would say, what you're saying that feminine intelligence is a gestalt. It would be an awareness of underlying unity. And, I think that the contrast then that you're making of the masculine intelligence would tend to be more problem solving and would be more around differentiations rather than the underlying unity. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, that's beautifully put. And I think if we, as we mentioned, problem solving, and there's an aspect of the growth and the intellectual ambition that can come with the masculine, which is so needed, and which is something that I have worked in a lot as well. Whereas for me, the feminine is more in the collective we, as you said, Jim. And I just noticed someone in the comments mentioned the Kali energy as well. So I think, I think that really points to the complexity of the feminine as well. She can be so fierce and so wild as well. So I didn't want to give the impression that I was neglecting that aspect of the feminine in any way, because, you know, I certainly don't know anyone who would want to get in front of a mother bear in front of her cubs, for example. So it absolutely, that very, very strong, fierce energy of the feminine is very prevalent as well. But it's still a protective of the collective is when I find that Kali energy comes out. It doesn't tend to come out, in my experience, when I've tapped into that for myself. It doesn't tend to come out when I'm focused on myself. It tends to come out when I'm focused on the collective, or I feel threatened in some way. So that's still an aspect of the masculine and feminine for me.
Yeah, let me just probe this point just a little bit more deeply by referencing Deborah Tannen. I'm sure you've read her book, You Just Don't Understand Me, which was an analysis of distinctions between the masculine and the feminine. You know, and she points out that if you take little boys as opposed to little girls, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, have a capacity to sit quietly and engage with each other in deep conversation, looking each other deeply in the eyes for long periods of time. And little boys of the same age have virtually no capacity to do that. Little boys are perpetually kinetic. They're bouncing up and down. They can't sit still for very long. They can hardly wait for recess. When they talk with one another, they'll have momentary eye contact and then they'll bounce off. The way that they even use language, according to Deborah Tannen, is different, that the women will use language in order to communicate deeply, emotionally, and the little boys will use language as tools, as a weapon, in a more utilitarian way. If they see something, there's a tendency to try to break it, to see what it's made of or not. Deborah Tannen has a whole series of studies about the masculine and the feminine psyches, as it were, that evolve over time. And then one of the points that she makes in the book is that because the culture is so dominated by a patriarchal mold, that the feminine organic understandings gradually are subsumed into the patriarchal modality. And then as a woman rises, as we see in many women political leaders, they become more and more masculinized. And I was reminded of this in the vice presidential debate a few nights ago between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. On the one hand, you have a white male that didn't pay attention to the boundaries of time, was talking over the interviewer and talking over Kamala Harris. And on the other hand, you had Kamala Harris, a Black woman, a woman of color, who you could tell through the debate was exquisitely sensitive to keeping her composure, smiling, and not acting aggressively. So I'd love the two of you just to comment on this. And again, what we're trying to get at, everyone, is what is feminine intelligence as opposed to masculine intelligence? How do we understand FemmeQ? Because to the degree to which we can understand that, knowing that aspects are common to both genders, we will be better served in understanding why it is that women need to be supported in their liberation as a matter of human survival.
Well, it
It's
sounds like
it's
just a quick one, Jim. Sorry, Mum, but it was such a beautiful example you just shared. Even though I didn't see I haven't seen the vice presidential debate, but I obviously know of both the people. That it almost sounds like they both expressed very exaggerated examples of how the masculine can be, how it can show up, and how the feminine can, in terms of if it's done in an unconscious way, which it sounds like is what Mike Pence was doing, where he was not considerate, this is obviously sounds like the shadow side of the masculine showed up in him. But what Kamala Harris exhibited in the understanding, the seeing the whole, the being conscious. It sounds like they may have, without having seen the debate, the way you described it, they may have exhibited two extreme sides, the dark side of the masculine and the light side of the feminine, very beautifully.
I think building on what Rebecca and you've said, Jim, and it's interesting, you used the word liberation. I personally don't think women need liberating. I think they need inviting. And I think, firstly, to access feminine intelligence, invite women to the table. Invite women, because we keep talking about gender and inclusivity, and I hear so many times men say to me, we can't find the women. I'm thinking, we're 51% of the population. You look for the women and they're there, the ones that can be invited to the table. So women are liberated, and women often won't show up because they're violated when they show up. And that's a strong word I'm using, that they're shut down in the conversation. They speak a different language often. They're being sensitive, and they have sensibilities that they're often working with their intuition to look at the whole of how a meeting goes and the flow of energy in the meeting. They may not describe it like that, but I've watched women work like that in boardrooms, in villages, in all certain circumstances, where they're watching for where the conversation's going and what's needed to be said. So I think the invitation has to be made for women, and the inquiry for men to figure out what's going on in that system that I don't know about. What's going on over there? What happened in my mother when she was giving birth? What's happening to Mother Earth at the moment as she's suffering and being violated by all the things we've done to her? And I personally think if we look to Mother Earth and her wisdom of cycles, of regeneration, of which we're doing next week, as you mentioned, Jim, this notion of regeneration is feminine, is looking for life-giving forces. And I think women are constantly looking. Feminine intelligence is bringing life to life. That's what it is for me, is we are looking for, how do we birth life? How do we nourish it and nurture it and give it its full potential, and revere the resources, the potential? And that's what women do in raising children. That's what women do in board meetings, is they bring the whole. They don't want to leave people out. They don't, in the essence of feminine, it's inclusive. It's much more inclusive when women are, mother hens, these terms we use around mothering and women. Oh, she's clucky at the moment. We use the animal metaphors. But I think the other thing that's very important about leadership, because you mentioned it, Jim, and Gabor Mate speaks about this, is the trauma that goes on in a woman's life when she's pregnant or when she's giving birth gets translated into the nervous system of the child. And I think one of the big topics we need to address, which women tend to do in care, is heal. We need healing. We need to heal the system that has been distorted, even in the masculine. Men need to heal and heal we need to heal our relationships with each other. But I think the deep respect of this innate wisdom and these qualities of compassion and reverence for life is really important, that we come back to that.
Well, let's dwell on that for a moment, Karen, because I think you're raising a real issue that is very topical right now, and that's the issue of transgenerational trauma. You know, if you think that the world has been dominated for at least 6,000 years, 7,000 years by patriarchal consciousness that equated the feminine and women with the earth to be conquered and used as chattel. And up until just a generation ago, even to the present day, in some countries, women are still considered property. In Saudi Arabia, it was only earlier this year that women were given the right to drive a car. And it wasn't until 1943 that in France, women were given the right to vote. And so this issue of trauma in the female and in the feminine, a traumatized lineage is important to speak about. And I want to parse this in the following way between mother and daughter, because if you look at the feminist movement, that exploded out into initially US and Western culture, then around the world in the 60s and then 70s. Remember Betty Friedan and various others, women leaders at that time. And now, Rebecca, you're the result of those 50, 60 years of intense struggle to work through the trauma. And I would also invite your comment, Karen, when you say that women don't need to be so much liberated as invited. If I remember the early feminist days, they had to kick down the door.
Totally.
This wasn't about waiting any longer for the men to wake up. The women realized they needed to seize it. And so, I would love to hear both of you on this issue of trauma, and whether Rebecca, as a millennial, and it would probably be, if we had someone from the Gen Z, someone born since the year 2003, it maybe even be less, as the young women coming up in age aren't growing up with the same trauma. Now, is that true? Is that your experience? Speak to us about transgenerational trauma and its liberation.
You go for it. You can just start.
So I'll start with the trauma part for me, Jim, because I've studied it because I was traumatized as a young girl. I think what I would say, without too much detail, but one thing I can remember is when I was the youngest in the family, and my father, being a strong Aussie bloke, would say, when I cried, would say, "Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about." So crying was not permissible. For me, that was traumatic because I became frightened of my own emotions. And I know that my mother was frightened of my father. She appeased him. And so I grew up traumatized, but I grew up so damn feisty. It was like, I'm not having that. I'm not going to be my mother. So I tried to revert from what my mother was into a feisty, which was a beautiful, wonderful mother, as best she could be with all the resources she had. And I didn't want to be like her because she was appeasing and she didn't have a place in the home. She didn't have respect from my father, etc., etc. So I adapted myself into this feisty activist, going to India and Bangladesh because I didn't want that future for my daughter. So I've sat with the women in India and Bangladesh and run workshops with them to have them find their vision. And you can feel the fight and the feistiness in me right now. That's trauma. That's trauma. And so I've had to heal. I've had to bring my own practices of healing to heal myself. And when Rebecca came into the world, or when I knew that I was pregnant, I was telling you this story the other day, Jim. I did everything. There was no electrical appliances in the house for 6 months because I was following the Rudolf Steiner's philosophy. I didn't want her vibration altered. You know, I wanted to be the perfect mother and have this super conscious relationship with my daughter. But I still didn't get it right. For all that I believed, I did my best. And I'm sure there were that I passed on, because it is scientifically proven that you pass on that trauma, as Gabor Mate and many others have shown. It's in the collective. So I think we are moving through the trauma, but I don't think we're there yet. I for sure know there were many things that I did that impacted the way Rebecca is and independent and lives her life. And I see it played out. Now, I'm not ashamed of that. I don't regret what I did, but I still see the patterns. And fortunately, I've done enough work to see patterns played out. And I love the phrase, guilty but not to blame. Yes, I was guilty of certain things, but I did what I knew to do and I did my best. And that forgiveness is critical in all of us. When we look at our parents, I've spoken to many men that say they were traumatized by their mothers being feminists, and they don't want to have the feminist conversation, and they don't want to talk about the feminine because they're scared of being emasculated. So I think there's a lot of trauma in our system around that fight and war and all of the things that we've been, and depression and postnatal depression, all of that influences the child's nervous system coming into the world. And Gabor Mate speaks about Trump as having a traumatic childhood, and which is why if you've been hurt, you'll hurt others. So I did my best in the early stages of Rebecca's life of fostering this, and she went to a Steiner school and all of that I could do to give her the very best start. But as Rebecca will tell you, growing up with me was like growing up in a workshop. So however it goes.
So Rebecca, as a millennial, what would be your comment on what your mother said? Do you feel it a little less in your generation? How's been your experience?
Wow. So I would, there's a lot there. Where would I start? I would definitely say I feel it less. And I think one of the things that has been the most incredible tool is the ability to have these types of conversations, which, as Mum pointed out, I used to joke it was like growing up in a workshop. And, you know, I did my first personal development program when I was 8, right? You've met my mum, you can get it. And the thing with that is, as much as I can make light of it and joke about it and things, I definitely would say that there wasn't the level of trauma that I've heard from Mum and her generation in my generation. But even more so, I think there's an awareness and a consciousness to even have these conversations, which is for me part of the big shift in my generation. So I've lived in conscious communities, I've done workshops, I've been in corporate boardrooms, I've done personal development, I've done spiritual programs, you know, I've done all different modalities and all different explorations in this discovery of trying to understand. But it's the ability to do that and to have these conversations and to be in the inquiry that starts to heal the trauma, which I don't see was as prevalent in the generations before. So I think I am definitely the beneficiary of the work that my mum did, and you know, maybe her generation as well. I think it's made my job a lot easier in terms of healing and moving through things. But more than anything else, I think it's the ability to have these conversations, to even talk about trauma, which my understanding was that, you know, you didn't in the generations previously in this way at this age. So I think that while trauma's passed down generationally, which I absolutely believe, I also think the ability to heal that has been passed down to me personally in a way that I'm incredibly grateful for.
Yeah, very good point. Let's talk about that healing process for a moment, because our inherited tradition has been obviously a traumatic one. And yet our generation, I would say the last couple of generations, have been struggling mightily to use the prima materia of the trauma in a transformational way.
Mm.
So as you both consider these matters, what would you invite in all of us as key ingredients in the transformation of trauma into healing?
I would say, firstly, understanding, and it's a phrase, again, it's not mine, it's Gabor Mate's, trauma is not what happened, it's what happens inside you when what happens happens. So two people might, as we all know this, two people might have the same experience, but how they relate to it and what it does to their nervous system. So in healing the trauma, what it does is it constricts us. And what Rebecca and I, and I'll say this as mother and daughter, which is why we both felt this conversation was important, is there's a lot that happens in the parenting and the child relationship. And what I'm conscious of is I am committed in this lifetime that I transcend what was handed to me through the vehicle of other women and my daughter in particular. So what I'm constantly at work on is, with Rebecca, is delving into what's my responsibility, what's her responsibility, and how do we heal when we've hurt one another. And one of the commitments we make between ourselves is we never walk away. That's never an option. So we've worked together in a massive project, and we've thrown our tantrums, and we do what we do. We get upset with one another and we tussle, but we never walk away. So we sit down.
We might have a time out, but we never walk away.
Exactly, for sure. And mine is more conversational. Rebecca's more of an introvert. I'm more of an extrovert. So we've figured out our patterns and what triggers us. And when I get feisty, Becky goes quiet. And then because I'm her mother, that has a different context to it. So I think this feminine and what we're talking about in feminine intelligence plays out very strongly in this relationship of mother and daughter, which was why we wanted to have the conversation, because it's not usual between mother and daughter that we talk about this. So I think the healing has to start with recognizing what hurts us, what hasn't been nourished, what we weren't given, and what we seek for in other relationships that we didn't ever get when we were small. And I didn't get tender, loving care. I didn't have that. I don't recall being stroked. So what do I do in my life? I teach women how to self-massage, because I wanted that. I never had it. And so we play out. And hopefully, I think the remedy to trauma is living true to the thing you yearn for, not seeking it from others, but giving it to yourself. That's my remedy. So if there's no one around to massage me, when in isolation, no touching, I continue with my daily body massage to self-massage and say, and Rebecca gave me a little mantra to work with. I love, you're beautiful, I honor you, you're doing a great job, you're beautiful just the way you are. All of those messages that counter the other that I got, which is you're useless, you're stupid, all of those that I was brought up with, that's trauma. So I think that changing the internal narrative versus doing therapy, and therapy is wonderful, but I also have found many different ways that we can heal the trauma. And if it's in our system, we have to work it with the body.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, how would you invite all of us to engage in that pathway from trauma to transformation and healing?
A few things, Jim, for me. And the first one is awareness or acknowledgement, and allowing. And what I mean by allowing is, Mum, we've talked about this a lot in terms of our relationship, but on a personal level as well. Giving space for the light and the dark side. I don't want to say good and bad, because that's a morale projection, but it's that element of not having everything handled, and it's okay, which is something that's become quite, very mainstream now, I think, with mental health in different areas. But to allow space to be a little messed up and to be human and to not have it figured out and to have tantrums and to project stuff when you do and to get triggered and to actually have that be okay. Because for me, that's the first part of actually having the space to confront the shadow side in order to be able to move through it. So it's acknowledging that it's there, and that's something that Mum and I do a lot in our relationship as well, is we have so much stuff come up. We're mother and daughter, as she's already referenced, but knowing that that's going to happen and moving through it is a part of it. So for me and myself personally, it's the curiosity to discover what else is possible while knowing that it's going to be a bumpy ride. And yesterday I had some, actually I was for a couple of hours in a really not great space and couldn't figure out why. I was trying to analyze myself and do all these things, and then just went, you know what, it's okay if I feel a bit shitty right now, and actually just giving the space for that to then move through it in a curious way to discover what's underneath it. So acknowledging it, awareness of it, and then being willing to go on a bit of a bumpy ride to get to the other side. And asking for help, actually, that's another big one for me, because that's something that I'm historically not very good at. I was raised by a very strong woman and was taught to be very independent. So something that I've really taken on is, what does it mean to ask for help and to be vulnerable and to not have everything handled? Because I never have it handled, I just sometimes make it look like I do, which can be really lonely. So acknowledging that and actually saying when I'm not okay, for me, takes a huge amount of vulnerability, which is something that I'm still very much at work on. So being able to ask
in process. We're all works in progress.
Yeah,
Let's turn to the future for a moment. Dr. Ferguson in the chat was raising a very important issue that is, I think, the cutting edge of gender, sexuality, feminism, masculinity. And that is one of the most extraordinary developments in the anthropology of humanity in this present historical moment has been the radical transformation of our notions of gender. We've gone in a few decades from, clear distinctions between men and women, masculine and feminine, to now we have everything from transgender, bi, pan, every conceivable way of understanding who we are as human beings as it relates to gender and sexuality. So a question that I'd love to put to both of you is, how would you apply, or how would you consider feminine intelligence in a transgender, pansexual world?
Shall I start? For me, Jim, I think the whole of transgender and gender, they both have to be included for the whole to exist. And why I say that is, the word integrity is often used around morality or ethics, but if we think of it, even in engineering terms, if something's out of integrity, then it doesn't work. So if you're building a pipeline, as I discovered from engineers, and there's a crack in the pipeline, it's out of integrity. So at the moment, for me, wholeness is transgender and gender. We can't not talk about gender when women are being killed in their homes through domestic violence in double digits in the first 2 months of COVID here in the UK. So we have to talk about gender and the disproportionate effect on women, even through COVID, that's happening. And some people are saying it's taken us back 70 years in terms of the impact on women. We can't not have the gender conversation while that exists, because of the violence and the violations and the disproportionate impact. And moving into the future, that is a new level of consciousness. It's a new level of awareness that people, all genders, are tapping into the higher qualities of our humanity. And that's critical. But we have to be able to hold the complexity of all of it. Mm-hmm. And I will not let go of the gender conversation, as much as I'm criticized for it, while my sisters in countries and in my country are being killed when they should be protected in their own home. So I think we have to hold all of it. Those that are rallying for transgender and their right to be not nominated by a gender, I salute them. I absolutely am backing them. Whoever has a right to speak, everyone has a right to speak and represent themselves in the way they want. And that's not my voice. My voice is for in a different cause, in a different way. So I think we have to find what we were commissioned with when we came in, and that happens to be mine, gender and feminine. Rebecca, what about you?
Yes, very great question. And for me, I'm in a woman's body and I identify as she, her. So there's a level of simplicity in that for me personally, that I don't fully understand this issue in all this topic, in all areas. But the feminine and the masculine is, like we said, it's not about just being in a woman's body or a man's body. So therefore, when we're talking about the masculine and the feminine, whether we're talking about someone who's transgender, who's non-binary, who identifies as a man or identifies as a woman, this topic applies equally to all humans for me, when we're talking about the masculine and the feminine. And that's just a way to understand the different energies that do exist in all of us. And I do think that it can become very complex because we're talking about masculine and feminine, which for me is distinct from gender. So the masculine and the feminine exists in everybody, whereas the gender is about men and women and how we identify, and transgender people and non-binary people. So there's two different sides to the conversation, and I can speak to my own experience more than obviously anybody else's. So I don't fully understand it in all ways, but that's how that's how I make sense of it for myself.
Well, thank you. And it came home to me about 6 months ago when I learned that a family that I know back in California, they have a daughter that was going to UC Santa Cruz, age 18. And she had known since she was about 9 years old that she was really a man. And she cultivated that consciousness in a female body, and was looking forward to the transgender process as she came of age. And she was in a relationship with a young man who was also at UC Santa Cruz, who had known since he was 8 years old that he was a woman.
Wow.
And they were in a relationship. And when I heard that, I realized that we've reached a point in our human development where everything that we thought was real has been deconstructed. And it's inviting us to a very, very deep conversation as to what actually constitutes humanity. I mean, for the last 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years, we thought that men were men and women were women, and there was some crossover, homosexuality, lesbians, and so forth, but we thought we understood the basic categories. And I think one of the most exciting aspects of the human journey in our generation is the explosion, deconstruction, reinvention, reimagining of what it means to be male, female, human, masculine, feminine, in all the dimensions. I mean, I think it's beautiful that it's the rainbow. that is the symbol of the explosion of gender. And so this issue of what the feminine means in this complexio oppositorum is not an insignificant discussion. And the fact that it's becoming so intense during a time of pandemic is a fundamental invitation, I think, to our sense of ourselves as human beings in a multicultural, multi-gender framework. So it's within that context that I want to, ask you a final question. Here we are with all this tumult in our gender and sexuality occurring while we're undergoing the intensity of a pandemic. So from each of you, any further comments on what you think is going on? And then what's your invitation to us as to what aspects of feminine consciousness or feminine intelligence should we be embracing at this particular juncture, given the world situation?
Jim, for me, you opened the conversation and talked about the sacred space that you've wanted to provide through Humanity Rising. And years ago, I wrote a book called Sacred Spaces. And what I know is a sacred space is a liminal space. It's the in-betwixt and in-between. We're not in the past and we're not in the future. We can't stand in either. And the liminal space has always been cited in ceremony, in religions, in mythology. And that liminal space, I believe, is where we are. And that's why Rebecca and I wanted to have this conversation, one, because it's unusual. And both of us, and I do believe very strongly, if we don't heal the relationship with our parents and the mother, we won't heal planet Earth. Because she's called Mother Earth for a reason. And I think we have to go back to healing. And that's why we're having this conversation and not a corporate leadership conversation, because I could have had that one. I've worked in corporate and I've been a businesswoman and all of that. But I think it's more fundamental now. I think we're in this liminal space, in betwixt and in between. We're confused, we're disrupted. We don't know what the future holds, but boy, we need to hold each other.
Beautifully.
And I think we need to hold each other like a family. And we have to return to the notion of, and I've been doing a series called the 12 Virtues, and one of the first virtues that we practiced was devotion. And what was interesting was when practicing devotion, I had all women in the webinar, and all of the women said, many of them said they didn't like the word because it represented cult, it represented they devoted themselves or sacrificed themselves. But I think we have to return to the essence of that word. It's deep reverence for something other than myself. We have to turn to the reverence of our mother, the mother that brought us into life. If we all put our hand on our belly right now, we've all got a navel. We shared heartbeat. We're here because our mother gave birth to us. And we're here, and I'm looking out at Kew Gardens right now, we're here because Mother Earth has hosted us. We have to hold each other. We have to return to reverence and devotion to each other, to each other's qualities, and to Mother Earth. And that's feminine.
Beautifully put. Rebecca?
I don't know if I can add much to that. I think that was exquisitely said, Mum. And I really agree. I'm sitting here in the jungle of Costa Rica, and the gift of Mother Earth is what creates life and allows us all to be here. So I think, exactly like Mum said, while how we honor our mother is part of how we honor Mother Earth. And I was just thinking about the collective and what happens to one part of it's happening to another. And actually, some of the oil sands in North America came to mind, because that's happening at the very moment when I'm sitting looking out at a Costa Rican jungle. So what's happening in the collective affects us all. And I think starting to bring reverence and devotion and gratitude to every single moment that we have connected to Mother Earth and ourselves and our own mothers, and the feminine in all of us, inside us personally, inside those around us, and actually giving it a moment to listen and to stop and to tap in to that voice inside all of us, and how do we honor it and respect it and give it space to be expressed in the world, which is what I see you're creating, Jim, with Ubiquity University, but also how do we start to have those conversations where the deep feminine is honored, whether it's in our homes, in our friendships, in our families, in a way that honors Mother Earth, ourselves, and the future for all of us.
Well, thank you both. Karen, say a few more words about the relationship between feminine intelligence and Mother Earth, because I think you're raising a fundamental awareness that the feminine intelligence in the human emanates from the earth. And therefore, the more we understand about the earth, the more we understand about Gaia, the more we're going to understand about FemmeQ. That's a very, very profound notion. Say more about that, and then anything you want to say, Rebecca, and then we'll wrap it up.
Jim, because I'm a very kinesthetic person, and everything for me, if it's going to become real, it has to be embodied, it has to be in the world. So I'm not one for, while we're having a conversation, the invitation I would have for everybody is to go and put their belly on the ground somewhere and feel the pulsation, feel what she gives us. We have no breath without her. We have no life without her. Her lungs are our lungs. Steiner spoke of that. Her digestive system is like the roots in the ground, is our intestines. Everything that we are is her. And so that's why I keep going back to, if we call it nature, it somehow separates again. Yes, I love being in nature, but if I relate to her as my host, as my mother, and that's why I bring it back to the feminine body, is we have to heal the relationship with our mothers, which is why Rebecca and I are here. We're constantly healing our relationship and going to another level where we go past title and we become two souls that are transcending the identities that we came into. So I think we have to transcend identity. We have to unite with the forces. I wouldn't be here without the energy and the forces of Mother Nature that put me together. And I don't think we hold that. I don't see many people holding that as sacred and feminine. So I think it's correlated. Feminine intelligence to me is Mother Earth. It is Mother. It's where we all came from. Heal mother relationships, heal the gender disparities and inequalities, and heal the earth. Pretty simple, but very hard to do in practice.
Rebecca?
I don't think I have anything to add to that, Jim. I think she summed it up pretty well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you both. This has been deep and it's been mythopoetic, and it ended exactly where we all need to be. Aware that we come from the mother, that we are the mother. And this conversation has been between mother and daughter, but it's been between earth and earth. It's the earth speaking to itself in eternal communion, and you two have embodied it so beautifully. My God, thank you so much. It's been rich. And I think the invitation to all of us, if I may, is to take up Karen's directive this weekend. Go out somewhere and lie face down upon the earth.
Mm.
And if you can expose your belly button, your navel to the earth.
Umbilical cord back in.
And put your heart right against the earth.
Mm.
You know, they say when you attune to your heart, the heart naturally attunes to the electromagnetic pulsations of the earth. So that's everybody's homework. Lie face down on the mother. That's the source. If I understand what the two of you have said today, that's the source of feminine intelligence, which all of us need to embody in whatever way, whatever color of the rainbow we happen to embody. So thank you all. And I have to say that this is the perfect introduction to everything we're going to do next week on Humanity Rising, which will include Karen. We're going to be talking about biomimicry. We're going to talk about regeneration. We're going to be talking about co-creativity. What does economics, what does human endeavor on this earth mean? Potentially, if we would use Gaia, if we would use Mother Earth as the wellspring of everything we need to be as we move into the future. So this conversation today couldn't have been a more perfect prolegomena to what we're going to be delving into next week. So Karen and Rebecca, I salute you. We all salute you. And thank you very deeply for this wisdom and this illumination. We'll check back in on Monday for Humanity Rising after we've all lain face down, navel to navel, heart to heart with the mother. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same station, 5:00 p.m. Central European Time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Rebecca. I love you, honey.
Thank you. Thank you. I love you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.